Hello people who are part of the general Ethereum community. The goal of this video is to talk about this idea around dedicating someone's time who's devoted to the space in between projects rather than, a specific project. So kind of devoting someone's time to the commons and the coordination and collaboration between projects rather than explicitly on a given project. And so this has been talked about and has happened organically in various ways, but I think someone specifically devoted could be very powerful. And I'll just kind of quote from Martin Kopelman earlier today when he was talking about this new OX initiative to make an ERC20 wrapper around ETH. And he says, more communication/coordination between projects atop Ethereum is needed. In this context, I appreciate this initiative. So that's the goal here. And we're going to talk about a couple different things to kind of contextualize us. First, talking about the macro trends that inform my thinking. Also talk about the kind of blockchain specific things that are happening here. Talk about what exactly it would mean to do this work and to be a meta community manager. And then specifically talk about me and why I could make sense, and then talk about like implementation and payment. So let's dive in with macro trends. So from a macro trend perspective, this work where you have a bunch of these different sub-projects that are working on their things, and they also have intersections in between them where there's, that are ripe for coordination, collaboration. That's all part of this concept called teal, which is not like Peter Thiel, but rather like the color teal. And teal essentially states that we as humanity have thought of ourselves and thought of organizations differently over time. And we used to think of ourselves as a machine with inputs and outputs, kind of results driven. That's what they call orange. And then we transition to thinking of ourselves as a family, kind of culture driven. And that's what they call green. And now we're transitioning to being relationship driven, being peer-to-peer driven, and thinking of ourselves as an organism, not as a machine or a family. And that's what they call teal. So that's the macro concept here. And teal is interesting because, and makes a lot of sense with blockchain specifically because of essentially Conway's law, which states that tech informs society, and then society also informs tech, that like the code you write will look like you, and you will look like the code that you write. And blockchains by their nature are very decentralized, peer-to-peer, bottom-up organizations, and that convergence should also happen with the teal, which are these companies like holacracies and these very flat organizations who are already working on some of this peer-to-peer work. So that's kind of one thing that's in my mind here, is to kind of try to make the Ethereum community more teal-y. And the other kind of macro trend here is from this book called Machine Platform Crowd, and the third one there about the crowd and kind of leveraging the crowd. And that's a big macro trend that we're seeing, is a move away from distinct cores into the more general crowd and more general community. And blockchain's all about this, and building community and, gaining consensus and working with your early adopters. And so that's part of this as well, is for someone to explicitly be in kind of the meta crowd space who's operating with the Ethereum project crowd, not just the Ethereum people crowd. So those are kind of two macro trends that are within this. And then talking about kind of blockchain specific things here, there's been a bunch of kind of organic work happening in the space. One of them was the Project Transparency project, pushed by Santiment, the Rocket Chat migration away from Slack, pushed by Aragon, or led by Aragon. Then this most recent one today in November after DevCon, this WETH ERC20 wrapper led by OX project. Those are kind of some of these organic things that are starting to happen here. And a way that I kind of like to imagine it is, instead of thinking about these blockchain ecosystem maps, traditionally they're thought of from like the competition and market perspective. But the way I'd like to think about them, or the way that I'd like kind of my role to exist within the space, is thinking from like the commonism or collaboration perspective. So thinking about the map, not from what customer service is serving necessarily, but rather thinking about it as, where do the projects overlap with each other and how are they collaborating with each other? And so you can see this kind of work already starting to happen with, consensus and the hub and spoke model that they have, and also the kind of, coalitions and alliances that they're building, like Ethereum Enterprise Alliance, the Accounting Blockchain Coalition, Blockchain for Social Impact Coalition. And they're doing it in a very explicit way with equity and tokens and those kinds of things. But I think that there's a lot of room, and with talking with you, seems like there's room for this kind of work to be happening, but with the greater Ethereum community, and not just within consensus in this kind of formal way, but maybe in more of an informal, not necessarily equity-based way. So that's another kind of blockchain-specific context here, is kind of like consensus style before the greater Ethereum community. And then you can also imagine it as this idea called the community token economy, which was a paper released recently by Jamie Burke from Outlier Ventures, which essentially states that the primary thesis is that it's helpful for projects in the space to federate with each other in order, and kind of give and exchange tokens with each other in order to kind of collaborate more easily, and like a rising tide lifts all boats kind of mindset. So those are things that are happening at the blockchain specific level. And now let's kind of transition. So those are all like context, the macro trend context, the blockchain specific context. Now thinking about, okay, what would it look like for someone to work explicitly in this in-between zone? Not directly with a project, but in this in-between zone. So I think that there would be two primary things here. The first is working with these existing cross-project collaborations. So those are the things I talked about before with project transparency and Rocket Chat and WETH. So this would be working with the leaders of those collaborations, specifically on governance, on their growth, what are their goals, and saying, okay, let's work with, let's say Sentiment at Project Transparency. How should this collaboration be governed? What are the goals of it? Can we, should I work to actively get more people into the project or the collaboration? Is there a way to kind of, cross apply governance structures across projects? Maybe do things like starting a cadence for a call. So this would be like saying, okay, people who are, working on this with this given collaboration, let's all, meet once a week or once every other week to chat about this collaboration. So that's what this looks like. And an example of that third one is our chain is already doing that with the proof of stake, and specifically the functional programming side of proof of stake, the ghost one that Vlad is like pushing more for these days. So they have these essentially weekly or maybe bi-weekly get-togethers where they talk about and collaborate on proof of stake. That's what this would kind of be like, but for the existing projects. So that's one side of the thing, is the projects that already exist and helping them, not the projects, but rather these collaborations that already exist and helping them achieve their goals and governance, what have you. And then another side here is kind of the expanding collaborations piece. So this one would be, and I think this is where it's most powerful in some ways, is to say, okay, for me to actively go out, chat with people who are in the ecosystem, understand their needs, the annoyances, how they could collaborate more, really explicitly try to understand this, and then to kind of implement some of those ideas in some of those groups. So, an example of this could be something like trying to formalize a blockchain-based business model canvas. So something like a token model canvas, and that would have in it, how should we do airdrops? How should we incentivize community engagement? Things like that. Another example of this could be like crypto economic primitives. So this is work that I do already around, curation markets and token curated registries. And I've, doing podcasts on that stuff, but to kind of create these explicit groups or these explicit circles and collaborations that say, hey, how are you doing TCRs? How am I doing TCRs? How are you doing curation markets? How are you doing prediction markets? How are you doing bonding? That kind of work. Another example of this could be like values. So like project transparency is essentially kind of an implementation of a transparency value within the space and the people who align around that transparency value. But you could imagine other values that people might align on, with an example here maybe being like the crypto pledge, where people who align on kind of giving back, they can get together and all take a crypto pledge to like give back or support nonprofit kind of things through their tokens in this way. So yeah, that's another example. Another example here could be governance. So this is like, essentially having a governance group, getting people together, understanding how you're doing governance, how I'm doing governance, and kind of working together as a unit and as a group to understand kind of cross-project governance. So those are kind of the two main buckets there, the kind of helping already existing collaborations and groups, and then finally expanding those collaborations to what the community desires, and to have someone kind of working exclusively on that. And then the other thing to say here is that over time, this can kind of evolve into various interesting things, stuff like formalizing the language around how these things operate, something like maybe making something like an Ethereum project alliance, which has specific sub-working groups, maybe making something like from a geographical perspective, thinking about something like an Ethereum city alliance. So those are things that could happen later as well. I wouldn't expect them to happen at the beginning. Now let's talk about me specifically and why it might make sense for me to do this role. So the first is that I'm actively coming to people with this and saying, hey, I feel like this is a need. I feel like this could be something that is needed in this environment. So should it? I'd be happy to work on it. The other thing to say is that I have personally kind of a process framework coaching background. I'm like a Techstars peer mentor, and I just wrote this article on like these 19 books as ways to kind of, from a process perspective, do optimized communication, prioritization, organizational design, that kind of stuff. I really love operating at the process framework coaching meta level. And the other thing here is that I'm also deep in the kind of teal side, the thinking about the blockchain organizations as organisms, thinking about this bottom-up peer-to-peer governance and communication systems. So yeah, I think that there are not too many people who have the kind of process background, the blockchain network from my podcast to do this, and then who's also passionate about teal. So that's kind of the group of reasons why it might make sense. And then from an implementation and kind of like paying perspective, there's lots of different versions of the way that this could work. I, in general, charge like $50 to $300 an hour for my consulting time, but that can be very flexible. And I don't think of this as much as consulting, as more like collaboration. And so I think that, it can be flexible with respect to money. It can be flexible with respect to hours. We can try out however much we want at the beginning, from as low as like 3 hours a week or whatever, up to like something like 20 hours a week. From like a payment perspective, I currently work through my Patreon, which is kind of like a subscription Kickstarter where you can pay me money per month to work. And we could do Patreon, but I'm also pretty tempted to use some of these inherently crypto projects. And one of them is called Stake Tree, which is made by Neil de la Rouvière, who's Simon de la Rouvier's twin. And Stake Tree is about, it allows you to essentially stake Ether towards a person, and then I get to essentially, if things are good, then I essentially get to remove that staked Ether over time to support the work. So you guys would support me through Stake Tree, and I would then work through Stake Tree and get money in that way. And there's another version of this, which is kind of more on demand. So these are kind of like the bounty system. So something like Gitcoin, where I could, something like Stake Tree is kind of a weekly or monthly cadence, but something like Gitcoin could be a way for me to essentially, and for us as a community, to say, hey, which are some of these projects that should be upgraded from like a pure task perspective, not necessarily a monthly perspective. So we can experiment with this, Patreon, Stake Tree, Gitcoin, whatever. I'm not strong on which one we should do. And yeah, I think that there are questions at hand, which is like, who pays what amount of money? I think that's interesting here. And I think that, and there's no right answer to this, but I think that at a macro level, the idea here is to put our money where our mouth is, and to put our mind to put our body where our mind is, which is to say, hey, we're trying to transition towards this world of communism. We're in late stage capitalism. Let's do early communism stuff, and to explicitly fund experiments like this one, where it's not a direct value for value trade-off, but rather it is people in the community supporting someone, supporting something that will definitely help them, but won't necessarily be an explicit like, oh my God, they're directly working with me and like spending all their time on me or whatever. So yeah, that's the idea. Let me know if you're interested in chatting more. I'm essentially trying to determine if this could be something that would work. I'd love to do an experiment here for the next couple months to see if something like this makes sense. And yeah, excited to chat with you all more about it and to push for collaboration and communism in this new blockchain world. Okay, thanks so much and bye.